In 1453, the Islamic forces of the Ottoman Empire at last fulfilled their prophet's 700-year-old prophecy that Islam would conquer Constantinople, the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the capital of what little was left of the Eastern Roman Empire. Islam's dream of also conquering Rome, the seat of the Roman Catholic Church, finally seemed within reach. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was far more populous, far wealthier, far stronger militarily than the West, which was small, poor, backward, divided by schism and heresy, disputed between two emperors, and for a while 2 or even 3 popes. But Rome was not conquered, and the Ottoman Empire eventually went the way of all mighty empires. It lost its military supremacy, it lost its wealth, it lost its European territories, and it was forced to sign one after another humiliating treaty of surrender with its enemies. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Muslims had to be rescued from a Russian invasion by Christian France and Britain. And in the 20th century, their empire collapsed altogether. The caliphate was abolished, and an emasculated, secular Turkish state arose from its ashes. How did this happen? How did the militarily and economically strongest state in Europe become the sick man of Europe? Did the fact that the Ottomans so strictly observed Islam's command to hold infidels in contempt, not to befriend them, not to learn anything from them, to wage jihad against them, and to forever and in all circumstances treat them as enemies, could these have had something to do with the empire's long, slow decline? Let's find out. My name is Alex, and welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. With the capture of Constantinople in 1453, Islam's dream of also conquering Rome, the seat of the Roman Catholic Church, finally seemed within reach. In 1480, Sultan Mehmed II's forces landed in Italy and sacked Otranto, killing 20,000 of its inhabitants, of whom they beheaded 8,000, and enslaved 5,000 more. This event is still commemorated in Otranto's cathedral. This pattern, beheadings, massacres, and enslavement, especially of priests, and immediately converting all churches into mosques, was followed by the Ottomans in all their conquests, including that of Constantinople. But before the Ottomans could march on Rome, the Sultan died, and they retreated from Italy. But this setback was only temporary. By the late 17th century, the Ottomans had conquered almost the entire Balkans, the modern states of Greece, Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, as well as parts of Poland and Ukraine. No wonder Martin Luther declared in 1528 that the Turks were the agents of the devil, who, along with the Antichrist, located in the heart of the Catholic Church, Rome, would usher in the last days and the apocalypse. The Ottomans were so much wealthier than the West, so much stronger, that in 1571, after they lost a major naval battle at Lepanto, the Grand Vizier told Sultan Selim II that the might of the empire is such that if it were desired to equip the entire fleet with silver anchors, silken rigging, and satin sails, we could do it. And it took them only 6 months to rebuild their entire fleet, but without silver anchors, silken rigging, and satin sails. In 1683, the Ottomans besieged Vienna for the second time, bringing more than 300,000 men, and cut the supply of food into the city. After 2 months of bombardment and famine, the sudden arrival of Polish cavalry sent the Ottomans into full retreat. That defeat was the turning point. the end of the long string of Ottoman conquests in Europe. Though they were still determined to submit the entire world to the rule of Islam, after their defeat at Vienna, they were slowly pushed back from their European territories, and by the early 20th century, they'd been expelled from the last of them. When the empire chose the losing side in World War I, it finally collapsed. The caliphate was abolished, and a secular, emasculated, and somewhat westernized Turkish state rose from the ashes. Why did the militarily and economically strongest state in Europe slowly fade away? At the root of the Ottoman Empire's decline was a common human failing, a sense of superiority to everyone else, and the arrogance and complacency that spring from sustained successes, the belief that failure is impossible. Muslims saw themselves as favored by a God who had commanded his followers to impose his rule upon the entire world. They saw their unprecedented military successes as proof of the truth of their religion. The lightning defeats of the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, and all the others, the creation in less than a century after their prophet's death of a caliphate that stretched from Spain to the borders of China, the largest empire the world had yet seen, not to mention the expulsion of the infidel crusaders who had brought their ragtag armies all the way from Europe only to be defeated by Allah's people. A religion that enforces its believers' natural tendency to consider themselves superior to all other peoples is bound to instill in them a contempt for those other peoples. This arrogance, this feeling of divinely approved superiority and contempt for others, combined with centuries of repeated military success, led to a fatal complacency, a conviction that the success had been not only deserved, but also divinely guaranteed. It was this combination, arrogance, contempt, and complacency, that ultimately doomed the Ottoman Empire, and it was the West's realization that it was the weaker party, that as the underdog it might not survive, that it needed to try harder, that ultimately reversed the roles. No law book, even one granted by a god, can provide guidance for every possible situation that might one day arise. In the early days of Islam, there was a rule called ijtihad, the exercise of independent judgment, whereby Muslim scholars resolved problems of theology and law for which the Quran and tradition provided no explicit answer. At some point, Muslim scholars decided that all questions had already been answered, that the gate of independent judgment was closed, and that all that was left to believers was to obey their prophet's laws and conquer the entire world for Islam. Moreover, in the Muslim tradition, all innovation is assumed to be bad. Their prophet Muhammad had warned, every innovation is misguidance, and every misguidance is hellfire, and that if anyone introduces an innovation in religion or gives shelter to a man who introduces an innovation, he is cursed by Allah and by his angels and by all the people. The worst innovation of all is to imitate the infidel. According to another saying of the prophet, whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. Ever since the ascendancy of the ultra-conservative Asharite theologians in the 11th century, Muslims were taught that only religious knowledge can be truly true. To say, for example, that mathematical knowledge is true, that 2 + 2 = 4, is to put mathematics on the same level as a revelation, and this is obviously heresy. So, there was no reason to seek out secular knowledge, no reason to study science. All necessary knowledge, everything a Muslim needed to know, was already known. All legitimate questions were already answered in the Quran and in the traditions. Anything not in those books, all the so-called knowledge of the infidels, all scientific knowledge, was not actually true, none of it. With the triumph of Asharism, the golden age of Islamic science came to an end. Mathematics and astronomy, in which Muslim scholars had earlier made significant contributions and whose study was to initiate the scientific revolution in the West, were abandoned. I made a video detailing the struggles between the ultra-conservative Asharite religious scholars and the scientists, and how the Asharites won. There's a link to it somewhere up here. In the West, one motivation for studying astronomy, besides simple curiosity, was religious, to maintain the calendar in lockstep with the seasons, to ensure that Easter always falls in the spring. But since there are no external constraints on the Islamic calendar, Muslims neglected the science of astronomy and took up instead the pseudoscience of astrology. But there was one area in which Muslims were willing to take advantage of infidel knowledge: weapons of war. While they were prepared to use the infidels' cannons, but only after approval from religious scholars, of course, they were not prepared to pollute their minds with the knowledge of how to manufacture those cannons. Instead, they employed defectors from the West. Ottomans took seriously their religion's commands to subjugate and humiliate infidels, and not to befriend them. They held themselves to be so superior to infidels that they could not even speak of them or to them without reminding them and themselves of the infidels' inferior status before God and Muslims. In political correspondence with infidel rulers, Muslim rulers regularly referred to them in insulting terms. The 8th century Caliph Harun al-Rashid began a letter to the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus with a salutation, from Harun, commander of the faithful, to Nicephorus, dog of the Romans, greeting. Even the Holy Roman Emperor was addressed as merely the King of Vienna. In their internal letters, Muslim rulers referred to Christian kings as kings of the unbelievers, and avoided honoring them with the title king. They would use the Turkish word for a low-level provincial governor. When one Muslim sovereign wrote to another, he used the classic Islamic salutation, "Peace be with you." But when he wrote to hell-bound infidel monarchs, this was replaced by "Peace be with those who follow the right path." Not only would the Ottomans not pollute themselves by traveling to the lands of the infidels, they refused to learn their languages or to read their books. If it was absolutely necessary for a commercial or diplomatic mission, they sent their own infidels, a Christian or a Jew, who acted as interpreters when needed. When Mustafa Hati Effendi, who had been sent on a mission to Vienna in 1748, was invited to the observatory for a demonstration of electrical phenomena, he described the toys and wonders he saw as Frankish trickery. Only in the late 18th century, in 1793, did the Ottomans establish their first resident embassy abroad, in London. Most of these first Ottoman resident diplomats in Europe were officials from the palace or chancery, brought up and educated in the old way, ignorant of Western languages or conditions, and mostly conservative in outlook. To judge by their dispatches, they learned little of the countries to which they were sent, and were not favorably impressed by what they did learn. If the Ottomans had been more receptive to Western knowledge, if they had been less determined to always wage jihad, if they had let the benefits of trade with the infidel temper their arrogance toward non-Muslims, if they hadn't viewed their relationship with the outside world as a strictly zero-sum game, it's possible they would have survived longer as a major power. To be sure, Christian Europe also believed itself to possess the one true religion, and also considered itself to be superior to all others, but that didn't stop Christian knights from admiring the courage of their enemies, a concession Muslims could never reciprocate. I'm certainly not absolving the West of blame for the centuries of war, destruction, and bloodshed. I'm only suggesting that the blame is not equally shared. If you'd like to support the channel, why not buy me a coffee at the link below? If you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, share the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.